and welcome to this bonus video where I'll be talking about the formation of new covens. This video is a follow-on from the previous series that I did where I was talking about how to potentially be able to join a new coven. And that inspired me to make this video so that we could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that new members of the High Priesthood may face when they start a new coven. So before I get going, I would also like to sincerely thank all of the members of my tradition and some of the members of the High Priesthood who contributed because I had posted some of these questions on our group chat, and many of them were very kind and responded in great detail, and I'm able to do this video because of their input. So why would you start a new coven? Now, the main reason in British traditional witchcraft to start a new coven is actually because members of the High Priesthood, new members of the High Priesthood, will hive from their home coven. That means that when you reach a certain level, perhaps a second or third degree, depending on your tradition, you may decide to hive from your mother coven and start your own coven. Another reason that you might want to start a new coven is if you leave the area of your home coven and you move somewhere else, then you might also want to start a new coven. When I'm talking about this, I'm specifically referring to British traditional initiatory witchcraft, and those are usually some of the reasons that you would start a new coven. So what exactly are the functions of a coven? Besides the obvious function, when we talk about a coven, we would say that a coven is a group of witches who practice their magic together. But a coven is actually so much more than that. Many times a coven and the people that form part of your coven will eventually start to feel like family to you, and I discussed this in another video. But these people are people that you can rely on. They would be there for you, and they are also there when you grow in your craft and when you grow and develop personally. These are people that you share your magic with, and these are also a very stable group of people. Unlike an open circle or some other groups where people come and go, this group of people are a stable group of people who are bound to be in your life for a fairly long period of time. Now, while being part of a coven isn't inherently for the purposes of belonging to a social group, most of the time you are going to socialize with these people as well. When we work magic with these people, we will support each other's goals and we'll work towards these goals together. Covens are often very empathetic, they are kind, they are welcoming, they are warm, and ideally they should be congruent in all that they attempt. When you enter into a ritual circle with your fellow coveners, you have perfect love and perfect trust for them. And you will very oftentimes also share some private details with them, or you might share confidences with them. Covens are also training groups. Aside from the obvious level where members of the High Priesthood or also senior members of the Coven will train new students to eventually aspire to become members of the Coven, training actually occurs at all levels of a coven. When a covener wants to learn a new skill, teaching and training will also happen at those levels. Members of the High Priesthood are also constantly learning and brushing up on their skills and expanding their repertoire, because if somebody in the coven wants to learn a new skill, you need to be able to at least point them in the right direction or give them a foundation of the skills that they might want to learn. So at its heart, a coven is also a training group. So what is the process involved when you start a new coven? Well, usually as a member of the High Priesthood, whether you're a High Priestess or a High Priest and you hive off, whether you are working in a partnership or whether you are working alone, usually the entire process from the get-go is on you as a member of the High Priesthood. You will start the coven and you will make all of those initial decisions about the coven. So everything is on you. And usually when you start a new coven, you are in many instances quite far away from your home coven. Now, many times you're not actually in a position to be able to take anybody with you from your home coven, although that's not unheard of, because there are instances where you may take one or two or a few people with you if you are going to establish a coven in a sort of nearby area to your home coven. But most often that's not the case. You will be starting it either alone or with a fellow member of the High Priesthood. If you're a High Priestess, you'll have a High Priest, and vice versa. I'd like to talk first about some of the practical realities that you are going to face when you start a new coven as a member of the High Priesthood. Now, when you start your new coven, and usually that's in a completely new geographical area, you will have a long road ahead of you before your coven is actually established. When you start off, you will usually start on your own, and then you will slowly build up a student group. And then once that student group is thoroughly trained, they may then be initiated, and that may be the start of your official coven activities, where you are able to start to celebrate Sabbats and Esbats with the rest of the group. Now, it's a really long road from where you start out as a brand new coven. And I know that for me, that was definitely the case, because I started my first coven in Edmonton in Canada, which is about 3,000 miles from Pennsylvania, where my home coven is. And for me, it was a completely different situation. And I think maybe I'll talk about that in another video where I discuss my journey as a witch. But for now, I just wanted to talk about the fact that when you start a new coven, it's going to look quite a bit different to your home coven, the one that you hive from. And specifically, if you hive from a coven that is decades old or many, many, many years old. So when you start a new coven, a lot of the knowledge and expertise and know-how is going to be centered in the High Priesthood. That's the High Priestesses and High Priests, because they are the more senior members of the coven. So naturally, most of that knowledge is going to be centered with them. When you come from a coven where there were very many other senior members in the coven, that dynamic looks a lot different, because as a covener, you could ask almost anybody in the coven any questions and they'd probably be able to answer you. But that's going to be quite different when you are starting out your new coven. But one of the things that I am very fortunate in and very, very grateful for is that I am very close to other members of the High Priesthood within my traditions, and I am very close to the elders, and we all have a really good, close working relationship. So I know that if I'm stuck or if I need more information, that I can go and talk to them, and I can ask them for their expertise and their opinion. So one of the things that I'd like to say is never be too proud to actually ask for help, because when you're a new coven, it's impossible to know all the things. You will only learn as you go through all of the steps and as you start to establish your new coven. So some of the thoughts that one of the members of the High Priesthood shared was that for them, putting a lot of thought into the coven itself is very important. In other words, if you are planning to hive, make sure that you put some thought into the process and into the decision making. For example, is it necessary to start a new coven? Is there space in the area for you to start a new coven? That is, if you are starting in an area that's close by your older coven. Then think about things like governance and structure. How are you going to govern your coven? What is the structure going to look like for you? Also think about things like, do you have the time and inclination to invest in starting a new coven? We'll see later that starting a new coven takes an inordinate amount of time in order to make it successful. Some of the very practical things that you might want to do before you start a coven, or as you are starting, is actually start a website first. Start a website and talk about your actual coven. So some of the very practical, basic things that you might want to look at when you start a coven are things like, what are the goals for your coven? What is the inquiry process for new seekers going to look like for you? And what is the application process going to look like? What type of people are you looking for to join into your coven? Of course, before you even start, it's really important to think about things like, do you have the time? Do you have the energy to meet these challenges of being a new member of the High Priesthood? Is there actually space in your area to be able to do that? Or would it be better for newer people to join an already existing coven that is part of your tradition? It's also really important to think about basic things like how often you are planning on meeting as a coven. Are you going to meet for all the Sabbaths and all the Esbats? And if you are going to meet for all the moons, as the full and new moons, or maybe some other moon phase, which one of those are you going to meet for? Could you alternate them? These are very basic things that you might want to think about. Another thing that you need to think about is planning in advance. That is planning all of your Sabbats and Esbats at least a year or 6 months in advance, because when you have a coven, a lot of people are involved in that process, and a lot of people want to be able to plan their lives as well. So what you want to do is make sure that you have good plans in place, that you schedule everything, and that you try to stick to that as closely as possible, because most people really desire stability, and they want to know that they can count on you just as much as you want to know that you can count on them. Also, be adaptable. That is, be able to adapt to the situations that you face. No matter how well prepared you are, there's hardly ever going to be a time that you are perfectly prepared for every single situation or issue that may come up. So be adaptable and be willing to change. Be willing to be flexible as well in your approach to certain things. I think it's very important to also be willing and able to admit when you are wrong. Be able to go in humility when you have made a mistake. These seem like basic things, but sometimes they're very hard to enact when you are in that position of leadership, is to actually enact that aspect of humility. And then I would also say that something that I have started to notice is that the saying that goes, when the student is ready, the teacher will arrive, very often seems to be the opposite way, at least for me, because I think when the teacher is ready, then the students arrive. And that's something that you should keep in mind, because really what that means is that as a member of the High Priesthood, you are going to want to continually grow and develop, both in occult terms, religious terms, but also in terms of your personal characteristics. Those are things that you would need to grow in as well. Stay true to your calling as a member of the High Priesthood. You are in this role because you are going to facilitate rituals, and you are taking on this vocational role. And part of this vocational role means teaching students and taking on coveners. Now, we can't take on every single person that knocks on our door, but it's important to just keep in mind that nobody is more or less worthy than another person. Sometimes they may be a better or a worse fit for our coven, but that has nothing to do with the person's worthiness. Be transparent in your leadership. And one of the things that I was taught very early on was not to sweep things under the rug. So when you are dealing with your coven, and even if you are interacting with other members in your tradition, it's very important to stay transparent, to lead by example, and to actually leave space in your coven and your group for people to be able to express any issues that they may have, or to talk about any hurt feelings or things that may be bothering them, and so on, to leave that space open to them, to even maybe formalize some time either before a meeting or whatever, where you can do regular check-ins and see where everybody is and see how everybody is doing and how everybody is feeling. I think foremost, and one of the things that sometimes we forget in witchcraft is that foremost we're actually human. We're still in this human incarnation, and we need to address some of these things. We need to take care of those mundane things like feelings as well. If you don't address these feelings and some of these issues early on, they can lead to a lot of friction in the long run. And sometimes they're really simple things to address, but it is important to actually make the time to do this. Progression and adeptness take a lot of practice and commitment, and they cannot be rushed. So one of the important things to remember is to have patience with your students and your coveners. They're going to progress at whatever rate that they're going to progress at. So the important message here is to just remember that you cannot rush them through the process. Now, often when you enter into the High Priesthood as a new member of the High Priesthood, there is an expectation that you are ready to actually do the job. This is very seldom the case. I know that many of us felt that we weren't ready to do the job. We might have been willing, but we weren't necessarily ready. Now, this can sort of be likened to a person becoming a new parent, where when you're expecting a child, you may attend some parenting classes and read many books, but you are never actually ready until you do it, when you actually have to do the work of parenting. And running a coven is a similar thing, where you are never ready until you actually do it. The experience only comes from taking that knowledge and putting it into practice. That's when the experience comes into play. And hopefully along the line you will gain some wisdom and become better at it. But in the beginning, you're very seldom actually ready to do that job. One point that might be overlooked when you are a new member of the High Priesthood is, do you have the time, the money, the resources, the energy, and the space to be able to actually perform this role? Because in the role of a member of the High Priesthood, you are going to need a whole lot more time than you thought you would need. You are going to need the energy to do this job over and above whatever it is you occupy your day with. So when you are in the role of a High Priesthood, you are going to need to have the time, or to make the time available to do this. You are also going to need the energy. So after a long day of work, or even sometimes during your day of work, do you have the time to answer multiple messages and emails? Do you have the time to do some of the things that are required of you? And then after hours, when a lot of this happens, you have to sacrifice a lot of family time maybe, or leisure time, in order to be able to do this job. So you also need to think about this in long-term situations, because as a member of the High Priesthood, you're not going to just be a member of the High Priesthood for a few months or even a few years. Usually this is a much longer period of time, and you're going to be able to have to give those things continually. You're going to have the time, the energy, the resources, the space available continually. Do you have the space? In other words, do you have a room in your home or a basement or whatever that can be dedicated to a ritual space where you can practice ritual? Do you have the space where you can have 10 or 11 people or even 13 people in your home when you are teaching them, and sometimes even more? Do you have that space available in order to do that? And if you don't, is there a community space that you can utilize in order to do that, where you teach people in that way? And then initially you will probably be taking money out of your pocket to be able to pay for that. Then there are also other things that you need to consider, very basic things. That is, do you have the money for extra things like tea and coffee and even paper towels? Do you have the extra resources to be able to provide the basic things when your coven starts? And what about candles? And when you are teaching, some of the basic supplies. That's something that I think we often forget, is that members of the High Priesthood will give of their own resources when a coven is brand new and starting out. So can you do that? These are things that are very important to just keep in mind. Now, before you actually even start classes, you want to talk to your working partner or the high priest or high priestess that you're working with, and you want to hash out some details. You want to talk about things like, what is your curriculum going to look like if you have a curriculum, or are wanting to have a curriculum for your new students? What is that going to look like? How long is that going to take in the year? How many times a month are you going to present classes? Are you going to get together once a week, bi-weekly, and so on? What are the individual classes that are going to be taught, and who is going to actually teach those classes? Now, one thing that somebody suggested is to make sure that you lean into your strengths. If you have somebody that you are starting a coven with, to make sure that you understand each other's strengths so that you can lean into those, whether it's leaning into the teaching strengths or whether it's leaning into other strengths where you would be responsible for different parts. Also, think about things further down the line in terms of when you have a coven that is already established or starts to become established, when are you going to make time for the individual coveners and their needs? Because the students initially will take up a lot of time and they will have a lot of questions, but that doesn't mean that when you have coveners they aren't going to ask you questions anymore, or they might not have special things that they want to learn, because they are also going to want to learn new things. They may have questions, so it would be good for you to think about these things. When are you going to make time for them as well? And then also things like, when are you going to make time for doing some fun activities like making candles or specific potions or whatever, or is that going to be incorporated into your class time? Or are you going to have separate classes for your coveners? Think about things like the different levels that would come in to your teaching class. Especially in the beginning, you don't usually have the luxury of being able to only have one Wicca 101 or a general introductory class into your tradition. You would often be taking people at various times throughout the year as new seekers come in and you accept them as students. And so you will find that you will have students that are at different levels and have progressed through different things. How are you going to manage that? Also consider whether you are going to make time available before a Sabbat or an Esbat in order to do regular check-ins, in order to make time for individual people's learning, in order to be able to advance their skills. I think something that is often forgotten is the members of the High Priesthood themselves and their learning. You are going to be really busy, so it's important to carve out some time for you to continue your learning. You are going to get students and coveners that are going to ask you questions that you may never have thought about. You may never have even considered these questions, and you will have to be able to answer them. And in order to do that, you have to make time for your own personal learning. You are going to have to make sure that you are kind of ahead of the curve and that you are always doing your own learning as well, because we know that we are engaged in lifelong learning, but it's good to make time for that. Otherwise, we aren't going to be able to fulfill our role properly. Things that I never considered with my high priest when we started was, when you have people that come to you privately, people in your coven or in a student group who come to you privately for either spiritual counseling or advice or to just talk to you about something, how are you going to deal with that as a working pair? Because when you have a high priest and a high priestess, some people may feel more comfortable going to one or the other. Often they're not going to go to both, but they would go to the person that they feel the highest level of comfort with. Then how are you going to share that with your working partner? Or should you share that with the working partner? These are things that you need to think about. Now, for us, we made a decision that if it is anything that is specifically going to affect our coven or ourselves or the larger tradition, that we would definitely share those things. Or we would talk to each other and just share the main points with them, but we might not go into major detail. But if you wanted to, you could also do an approach this differently, and you could say, well, if somebody's going to talk to one, that one is going to share it with the other one, and that you need to make sure that your students and coveners understand that you aren't going to sweep anything under the rug, that you're going to be open, clear, and transparent in your communications. But that's up to you to decide, but it is something that you want to decide much earlier on in your actual starting of your coven. And then related to that, you as a working pair might decide to make time where the two of you specifically just get together to talk about coven issues, tradition issues, or things that you might just want to discuss or talk about. Will you get together once a month? Will you get together weekly? Will you have a phone call now and again? Will you have a group chat? How are you going to work on your communication? Because if communication is lacking between the two of you, it's going to wreak havoc in the rest of your coven. So that's also something that you want to plan for ahead of time. Decide on your level of expectation for your students and coveners, and then make sure that you share that level of expectation with your coveners and students. Tell them what it is that you expect of them. So, for example, if you expect everybody in the coven to attend all of the Sabbats, all of the SBATs, and all of the classes, and maybe all of the social events, then you need to tell them that that is your expectation. This is going to depend on your own personal decisions as members of the High Priesthood, but it's important to talk to them about those things and tell them what your expectations are. Assess your soft skills. Assess your communication prowess. It's very important to think about your adequacy in this regard. Are you able to talk to people and to be able to smooth over hard feelings? Are you able to navigate complicated interpersonal relationships? If you feel that you struggle with these, then it would be a good idea to perhaps attend a course or to look for training elsewhere where you can actually improve these skills, because when you are working with human beings, you are always going to need to have really top-notch skills in this department. But also never be afraid to ask your elders and other members for their advice, because often they will have good advice in situations that you may never have even thought about. Decide what level of students you are willing to take on. Now, when you start a new coven, you often don't really have a choice in that matter, because often the new people are brand new to witchcraft, and you would have to start at a very basic level. And if they're not brand new to witchcraft, they are at least brand new to your tradition and your religion. So you would have to start at a basic Wicca sort of 101 level. And in the beginning, you don't really have a choice there. But when you start to establish your coven, you may have the option of having more senior members of the coven teach the Wicca 101 classes and to assist with some training. And then you might have the option to say that you would only take more advanced students who are perhaps more skilled in the occult, but may not know the religious aspects or the tradition aspects, and you may be willing to teach those. But make that decision earlier on, because you may enjoy teaching. You may want to teach Wicca 101 for the rest of eternity, but not all teachers are going to want to do that, and it's important to make that decision and to at least give it some thought early on as well. No matter whether you are a member of the High Priesthood starting a new coven, or a covener or student joining a new coven, it's imperative that you get the support of your spouse or partner. You are going to be spending your energy and your time, and it's going to be invested elsewhere. If you don't have the support of the spouse or partner, I would almost even go as far as to say that perhaps you need to reconsider this. Reconsider whether this is something that you are going to be able to accomplish, because even if you have the most amazing spouse or partner, when you have to commit a large amount of time away from your relationship or your household duties or whatever you have, there might be a bit of a strain on your relationship if they don't give you their support and their buy-in. So even for the most amazing spouses, it can cause some strain if you don't have their support, buy-in, and understanding. I can remember many instances where I saw firsthand some of my elders and my teachers who had to drop everything they were doing in order to deal with certain issues that may have come up, in order to talk to coveners and students and give support and spiritual counseling when they needed it. So they had to leave some of their own private fun leisure events in order to do that. I have witnessed them sitting in a car park talking to students or coveners or whatever when they had issues, and eventually deciding to simply go home and not engage in that leisure activity because they had to do this. Now, if you don't have a very understanding, supportive spouse, this is going to be very, very difficult. If you don't navigate this carefully, this will lead to resentment and hard feelings, and that's not really something you would like to have in your relationship with your spouse or partner. So go ahead and have that conversation very early on. Now let's think about some of the challenges that you may face when you are starting a new coven. One of the first things that I think you might find challenging is how to decide who is going to be a good fit for your coven. Unfortunately, there are no standardized tests available for this. You aren't going to be able to test if somebody is going to be a good fit for your coven, and you will often, to the best of your ability, make the call, but it could still be a hit or miss. Sometimes you could still make a mistake and you could choose somebody who may not be a good fit for your coven. Now, this may be very difficult for some people to understand. But we are an esoteric religion. And what that means is that we are exclusionary and we are selective. We are not an exoteric religion. In other words, we are not a congregation and we are not a religion for the masses. We are not inviting everybody in. Because it's not a religion for the masses, sorting out who's going to be a good fit for your coven is going to be very challenging sometimes. Even if you are very experienced, you could also get this wrong. Making sure that you are well disciplined is part and parcel of being a member of the High Priesthood. When you become a member of the High Priesthood, it is a given that you are incredibly passionate about the occult. And you know how much time to appropriately sacrifice for the coven and others in your tradition. When you start off as a witch, you enter the first degree, usually we do that from a very selfish perspective because we have wanted to improve our own lives. Only when we get to the vocationals do we start to understand the mystery of making those sacrifices. A good amount of time is going to be spent sacrificing your time for others and their pursuits. It's also going to benefit them as much as it's going to benefit you. Some people may say that they understand the concept of sacrifice, but you're not really going to understand that concept on a day that your back is hurting or you have a headache or you're exhausted or whatever. You're going to use your iron will and you are going to overcome all of those things because people are counting on you. And just as much as they are counting on you, you are counting on them. Whether you are making the sacrifice to provide your time and energy and so on, they are also sacrificing their time and energy in traveling to the event that they are supposed to attend. Obviously, there are times when you are ill and contagious, and then you would have to cancel your events because you don't want to make other people sick. But there are many times when you still have to make those sacrifices, but it's important to also keep in mind the concept of balance and harmony. And finding that balance and harmony can sometimes be rather challenging in itself. Along with balance and harmony and exercising your iron will also comes the ability to schedule properly. That means making enough time available for a coven meeting or for a teaching group, and also making time available for different initiates to be able to do things together, or making time for students to spend time together and to grow their bonds. So a very basic mundane issue like scheduling might be something that you would also have to look at. Now, not everybody is going to be a good fit for the High Priesthood. And that's something that takes a lot of time to collectively sort out. To be able to distinguish whether somebody is a good fit for the High Priesthood or should rather just stay an initiate is sometimes rather challenging in itself. Not everybody can or should become members of the High Priesthood. They are actually often much better at operating in the coven that they are initiated into. There is space for everybody's unique skills within the coven, and we need people at all the levels in the coven in order for the coven to be successful. Some people will be able to lead the rituals, and other people will be able to blend their energies to the collective will of the coven. The members of the coven that are not members of the High Priesthood really are the beating hearts of the coven. They are what make the coven. The High Priesthood are simply ritual facilitators, and they can also mediate issues for themselves and others on the mental, physical, and astral planes. Another challenge that we might find is that not everybody is going to be the right fit for your teaching group or your coven. And I can tell you from first-hand experience that it really hurts when the first person says that they don't think your coven is a right fit for them. Now, logically, we know that everybody is a sovereign individual and that they can make their own decisions, and they should make decisions that are right for them. But it doesn't mean that that doesn't hurt a little bit when that does happen to you. If you are fortunate, if somebody does decide to leave your teaching group at the beginning stages of somebody's training, or at least during their training period. So if somebody does decide to vote with their feet and leave, we need to just remember that they are sovereign individuals and that they're entitled to leave if it isn't a good fit for them. And it's great because they haven't actually made any commitments to your coven at that point. It's an entirely different situation if you face something like that when they are already coveners. Now, aside from the very difficult aspect of choosing people who you think might be the right fit for your coven, is actually telling somebody that they are not a good fit for your coven after they have already been training with you for a few months or even a year. That's very difficult, and it can be very devastating to the student. And I know that some people have said that they were petrified of actually saying to their early students that they were not a right fit for their coven. Although it's fairly petrifying and not great at the moment, I think you are doing them a kindness because you are allowing them the freedom to not only find their own way, but to find something that would be a better fit for them and to find something that would be right for them. So you're doing them a favor in the long run, even though at the time it doesn't often feel like that. Now, one thing that I know that I personally struggled with, and I know that other members of the High Priesthood have also expressed similar struggles, and that is putting your expectations of yourself onto your coveners and students. Not everybody is going to be as passionate and driven and excited about the occult as you are. They may not even have some of the skills that you have in terms of being able to assimilate and manipulate information or memorize information. Everybody is going to have their own process of assimilation of knowledge, information, and skill. That brings me to another point, and that is being able to, within yourself, understand what level you can teach at. Are you able to teach people with different learning needs and different learning skills? Some people may have dyslexia or other learning challenges. And are you able to facilitate learning for them? That's something that's quite important to understand, because that would also perhaps be an indication of whether that's somebody you can actually train and would be a good fit for you. Because not all teachers are going to be good for all students and vice versa. So it's important to understand at what level you can actually teach, and are you able to adapt your teaching style in a classroom where you may have 10 or 12 people who all function at very different learning styles and different abilities and skill levels. So are you able to do that without putting your expectations onto the whole group? One thing that people will often say when they want to join a student group is that they want to join the Coven for the purposes of community and because they want to be able to talk to like-minded individuals. Now, one of the challenges is that when they define community, it may be something completely different to what you have in mind as to what community means. And the type of community that you can provide in your coven may be very different from what they have in mind. Another aspect to consider is that when people come into a tradition, they may really have no idea what the religion is actually about. And you may find that they don't or are not able to discuss things with people in the coven because they're not going to necessarily be like-minded in that way, because they may not at that stage have the religious or tradition understanding. And so it's important to perhaps prepare them for that. Assessing somebody's mental health can sometimes be a challenge, but it is important for members of the High Priesthood to know if somebody has a mental health challenge. It's also important to know that that person is consistently receiving the mental health support and therapy that they need in their lives. Now, mental health issues shouldn't be exclusionary and shouldn't be used as a basis of exclusion for joining a coven, but it is something that I feel is important so that we know as members of the High Priesthood that they are well supported. And that brings us to the end of this bonus video. I know it was a very long video, but I received some amazing contributions and thoughts from people in my traditions that I really wanted to share with you. I hope this is beneficial and has been informative. As usual, please like and subscribe and ask your questions in the comments below. Blessed be.